going to talk about the New Jersey auto insurance law and take away some of the complexity so that we can all understand the basics of what exists and the intent and purpose of it. So New Jersey car insurance law is unique to New Jersey residents who own a car in New Jersey, and it's what's called a tort option. Tort is just a fancy way of saying somebody failed to act in a way that other people should act. They violated some safety rule, whether it's a formal rule or not, and somebody else was hurt as a result of their negligent act. There's a whole video that I've done talking about the basics of negligence law, and I would encourage you to watch that because I go into some level of detail explaining all the different types of torts and how one can recover when they're injured when somebody else acts in a careless way. But this is going to be limited to New Jersey car insurance and the tort option. So the tort option is really broken down into two broad areas. One is you have a right to sue, unlimited for all of your pain and suffering. The other is you pay less insurance premium, and when you pay less insurance premium, you have less rights. And what's the reduction in the right? The right to sue for all injuries from a car crash. Only certain people, when you have reduced rights, are entitled to recover for certain injuries, which I'm going to go into detail about. But the broad concept behind New Jersey car insurance law is that the individual who purchased the insurance is the one who purchases their rights or purchases less rights, frankly. And the terms that are used, what you will often hear, is called nonverbal or verbal threshold. Nonverbal means that there is no qualifying injury that's required to recover. You have unlimited right to sue for your pain and suffering. And at this point in time, which I'm going to come back to the verbal threshold and nonverbal, but I want to break it down into two broad areas because what is often intertwined and confused is the economic loss or non-economic loss. Because when we talk about the verbal threshold or nonverbal case, it's limited only to the non-economic loss. And what is economic loss? Economic loss, and the way I always think about it, is what either should have gone into your pocket and didn't, or you had to take out of your pocket and pay somebody as a result of injuries from a car crash. So what are those two broad areas? Lost income is an economic loss, or payment of medical expenses. That's an economic loss. That is covered in a different part of your insurance policy, which is called PIP, Personal Injury Protection. What is PIP? It really covers all of your medical benefits. Now, the default level of available PIP, I'm going to define it as personal injury protection, economic loss. The default amount of coverage in New Jersey is $250,000. And the theory is that nobody should suffer any economic loss. Nothing should affect them economically. All of their medical bills should be covered, and lost wages, lost income should be covered through their PIP coverage, personal injury protection. There's a certain level of premium associated with that, and if that premium is too high, individuals can choose to reduce that premium from $250,000 down to $125,000, down to $75,000, and there are unique scenarios where it can even be less than that. But the broad concept is that nobody in New Jersey who's involved in a car crash should suffer any economic loss. So if all economic loss is covered, what is left? It's called non-economic loss. Non-economic loss is really things not related to payment of doctors or lost wages. It's related to the injury and insult that your physical body has suffered and the pain and suffering as a result. So that's what non-economic loss is. Non-economic loss is intended as compensation for the pain and suffering and the physical injuries that an individual suffered in a car crash. So in New Jersey, there's two groups of people. One who have no limits on whether or not they can recover for their pain and suffering. They do not require a qualifying injury. It is called unlimited right to sue. And that you get to determine when you purchase your insurance. It's a bit more expensive, but I would suggest it's worth every penny if you've seen the catastrophic events that happen in car crashes. But unfortunately, oftentimes our own personal economics prevent us from purchasing the unlimited tort insurance. So for a reduced amount of money, one can purchase what's called a verbal threshold or limited right to sue. The people in this group are only allowed to recover for their non-economic loss, their pain and suffering, if they have a qualifying injury. So the way it works is if you've purchased a limited right to sue, a verbal threshold insurance policy, you're only allowed to recover for your pain and suffering if you have a qualifying injury. If you don't have a qualifying injury, then you are limited to recover only your personal injury protection benefits, your medical bills and lost wages, which will be defined by what is your PIP coverage. Now, whether or not the insurance company, if you do recover and have a qualifying injury, is entitled to receive any of those monies back as a lien on your case, I've covered in an entire different video, which I would encourage you to watch, because medical liens there's complexity to it, but the simple truth with personal injury protection and no fault coverage, there is no lien for the base amount that you get the benefit of. But there are scenarios, which is covered in the other video, which I would encourage you to watch, where part of the personal injury protection may have to be paid back to the car insurance company. So a broad overview, if one purchases a full tort non-verbal threshold, you have an unlimited right to sue for your pain and suffering. And pain and suffering I define as two broad areas: the physical injury and the emotional consequences from those physical injuries. They are truly separate and distinct because while somebody may have suffered a broken elbow that required surgery and ultimately they regain their range of motion, the physical consequences may in fact be diminished over time, which we hope, but the emotional consequences often last far longer than those physical injuries, in the form of anxiety in certain scenarios that may have a triggering event reminding one of the original crash that caused it. I've seen too many people who suffer over long periods of time related to the underlying emotional consequences from a crash more so than the physical injuries. But with an unlimited tort, the unlimited right to sue, you recover for all of that. A contrast to the other side, which is a verbal threshold, requires a qualifying injury to recover for your pain and suffering and the emotional consequences. So what is a qualifying injury? Well, if somebody has purchased a verbal threshold policy, they can only recover for their pain and suffering if they've suffered, in essence, a catastrophic injury. And a catastrophic injury is defined in the statute, in the law. The most catastrophic of all is death. Secondly, dismemberment. Dismemberment meaning actually loss of a body part. Significant disfigurement or scarring, not just a scar, but it has to be deemed to be significant. A displaced fracture, broken bone, not just a simple broken bone, but it must be a displaced broken bone, which is a broken bone generally from a high impact crash, not a simple broken bone. So oftentimes people may have a simple broken collarbone or forearm or a broken finger. That would not qualify as a serious injury for purposes of a verbal threshold. Loss of a fetus is another qualifying injury. And then lastly, injuring a body part permanently, one that will not heal and return to its normal function through further medical care. The permanent injury, if a doctor will come forward and say, well, somebody has a herniated disc, but a surgical procedure will return that functioning of the spine back to normal, then one does not qualify for a verbal threshold serious injury for purposes of the New Jersey statute. So oftentimes people will have a surgical procedure, and the surgery in and of itself does not qualify if you purchase the limited tort provision, the limited right to recover from a car crash for your pain and suffering. Now, don't confuse this with the right to the medical benefits to have the surgery paid for or the lost income paid for. That does not require a qualifying injury. Everybody gets that automatically from the insurance of the car you're in. The only thing that is limited is your ability to recover compensation for yourself or an injured passenger in your car when a limited tort policy is purchased. So the last thing I want to talk about with respect to New Jersey car insurance, and I hope I made that a little less complex, maybe a little simpler than normally explained, but I'm going to add a little complexity to it now, which is the verbal threshold only applies when we're dealing with a covered versus covered vehicle. What does that mean? Only when a car crash occurs between another vehicle that also provides personal injury protection, because then each of those vehicles recover the medical benefits from their own car. Where verbal threshold does not apply is when there's a covered vehicle and a non-covered entity or vehicle, then the verbal threshold does not apply, and you can recover from without proving the qualifying injury or the serious injury for your pain and suffering. And what am I referring to? Specifically a tractor trailer as an example. A tractor trailer, given a particular size and weight, is not a covered vehicle. They do not provide personal injury protection as part of the insurance. So if a tractor trailer causes a crash and the tractor trailer does not provide personal injury protection, then regardless of the type of tort coverage you purchased, verbal versus nonverbal threshold, you're entitled to recover from the tractor trailer for all of your pain and suffering. And there are other scenarios where, for example, if there's a road design defect and that road design causes a crash, the county that's responsible to maintain that road is not a covered vehicle, obviously, then the verbal threshold wouldn't apply. And there are other scenarios where verbal threshold does not apply. But in most instances, car crashes are between two covered vehicles. And if you purchased the lower policy that limited your right to sue, then it's necessary to prove a qualifying injury to recover for your non-economic loss, for your pain and suffering. Otherwise, you're limited to just your personal injury protection. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions or you'd like more information, please feel free to reach out to me.